Well, hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Andrew Little, and I will be running this webinar today on Client Manager. This is part one of two webinars we have scheduled for Client Manager. Today's webinar will be focusing on the basics. So what I really want to cover today are essentially getting Client Manager set up and how you can set up Client Manager and utilize it and customize it for your requirements of your office. Righty-ho. So part one, the basics. This is what I plan to cover in today's webinar. We will touch on a couple of other topics as I go, but those will be expanded on in more detail in part two of this Client Manager webinar series. So the first thing I want to cover today is the Client Manager setup. Where should I install Client Manager in my office? How do I set it up? How to get the most value out of it? How to get it to perform the best, and so forth. I'm going to delve pretty deep into this. So we'll cover all the basic setup options and then a few more advanced setup options just to make Client Manager running exactly how you want in your office, maximizing its efficiency and so forth. I will be covering the basics of indexing and folders. Client Manager basically watches a set of folders on your network or on your local machine, depending on how you set up, where your tax returns are kept, and it keeps an index, the status of your tax returns, so that when you open TaxCycle, you can quickly review and find returns that you want without having to browse through your file system to figure out where on earth did I save Andrew's tax return. I can simply punch Andrew into Client Manager and we'll find all those returns for me. Leading into basic searches, TaxCycle, we've tried to give you a more modern search experience, something you're more familiar with in using modern search engines on the web. You're not constrained to just someone's SIN number or their first name or the last name. We'll be showing you how you can search for a combination of data points from returns to really find the returns that you want, hopefully delivering an experience that you're more used to. After that, we'll be going through the different views and previews. Once we've got Client Manager set up and we know how to run some searches, we'll show you the basic views. This is how we present our data. We have two different views to do that. We have a tax return centric view, if that's how you prefer to look at your data, or we have a client centric view, if that's how you prefer to look at your data. So I want to see my clients with their returns as opposed to my returns, and then what client owns that return. And lastly, in today's webinar, just some basic functionality using search results from our views, opening tax returns, opening returns in new windows, carrying forward files, and so forth. So let's get started. So I'm going to switch over here to TaxCycle, which I already have open. So the first thing we're going to do today is we're actually going to jump into options, and I'm going to talk in detail about how to set up your Client Manager and what each value means and how you can apply it in your practice, whether it's relevant or not. So we can open up the options dialog here from TaxCycle by clicking the options button on the left, or if you're like me, I have pinned the options button to my quick access toolbar at the top here. So I'm just going to open that up. I am going to double click here on the title bar just to maximize that window so we get maximum viewing space for this webinar. Righty-ho. So Client Manager, if I come down here to the Client Manager section of my TaxCycle options, this is the basic tax Client Manager overview. At the moment, my mouse is not responding. There we go. At the moment, this computer is not set up as a Client Manager server. For today's webinar, I am going to use my webinar machine as my Client Manager server. So depending on how you've got your practice set up, whether you have dozens of tax preparers and you have a centralized server in the office, or whether or not you have a few tax preparers and perhaps there's one more powerful machine than the others. We generally recommend that the best place to install a Client Manager server is on your file server. That way there, Client Manager gets installed. It runs as a service. So Client Manager is an application that's independent of TaxCycle. It runs in the background. Because it runs as a service, it runs 24/7. You don't need to have anyone logged in to use it. It's constantly running and it's constantly monitoring your tax returns for status changes. And when it gets notified of these status changes, it then updates the database. So we would recommend that if you're in a larger office, you install the Client Manager service on the same machine as where your files are kept, traditionally a file server, if you have a separate file server from a domain controller. Or if you're in a smaller office, you may have a dedicated machine that hosts your files. That's fine. That we would recommend that machine for the client manager server. If you have your tax return stored, say, on a network-attached storage device or a NAS drive, that's fine too. You obviously can't put Client Manager onto your NAS drive, but what we can do is we can put Client Manager onto another machine in your office, and we can configure it to reach across the network to look at those tax returns on your NAS device and monitor those files for changes, so it can update the database with the current status of each return. But for the simplicity of today's webinar, I'm simply going to use my webinar machine as my Client Manager server. So at the moment, I don't have any Client Manager server running at the moment. I'm just going to make changes to my options profile. So now I'm editing my Trilogy YYC. Oh, my mouse is playing up. Here we go. Okay, so we will come and use the setup wizard a bit later, but I'm just going to go through and talk about what each section here actually means. So the status of the Client Manager, essentially we know this computer is not set up as a Client Manager server. We would recommend generally that you have one machine in your office. As I alluded to earlier, your file server, you have one Client Manager instance running. And once that Client Manager instance is running, you can have all your machines on your network point to it, and that Client Manager server does all the heavy lifting for you. Connect to a server on your network. So what we can do here is we can click to discover servers on your network, and this will tell TaxCycle, please go find all the other machines in the office that actually have a Client Manager server running. This is particularly handy if perhaps you install 1, 2, 3 X number of workstations into your network. You can go and have them discover where your Client Manager server is, and we can automatically connect. We won't be doing that just today because I will be running the setup wizard, so we can go through each individual step and fine-tune how we want Client Manager set up on this machine. Lastly, we have some general options down here. First of all, client management is enabled. If I turn this option off, Client Manager simply goes away, and it will not bother you. You will not get the search bar in TaxCycle. If you use your own mechanism for managing your tax returns, that's perfectly fine. You can tell TaxCycle, I'm not interested in using client management. Please turn it off. But for today we are, so I will continue. I'll come back and talk about a few of these other options now. So we had some feedback on this. General options. So by default, if you push the F3 button in TaxCycle, it will open Client Manager. So it's early on, if you're preparing returns and you inadvertently hit the F3 key on the keyboard, instead of perhaps doing an override or opening fast find, which is F4, you would open up Client Manager, and that would take several seconds away from what you're doing. So we can certainly alter that behavior by not allowing F3 to open Client Manager. I will get to this a bit later when we talk about searching, but by default, when you are in the Client Manager search bar and you push enter, TaxCycle will run a full search. We've had lots of feedback. Some people like that, some people don't, so you can turn that off. And lastly, we have some batch options down here, whether or not you actually allow the Client Manager to do batch carry forwards and batch transmissions, but they are topics we will talk about in our part 2 webinar. So I'm going to scroll back here through my Client Manager options, and I'm going to start the Setup Wizard. So what is the Setup Wizard? So the Setup Wizard is basically a way for you to either connect to an existing server on your network, which we will cover later, or set up this machine as a server. So because I've identified this machine as being the server that I want to put Client Manager on, I'm going to run this particular setup now. So I'm going to set this up as a server. So the first thing we do is we can give our Client Manager server a name. So when we click Discover and we want to find where it is on the network, this is the name that will be presented. So I'm going to give it a more relevant name. So this is going to be Trilogy's head office Client Manager server. The name can be anything you want. As I said, it's really just used to identify this particular Client Manager server on your network. We'd also have another option here. If you work alone or travel a lot, you may want to create Client Manager as a standalone or private server. By default, when we set up Client Manager, it's publicly available to all the machines on your network. It's publicly available on a domain network and private networks. Now, by default, Client Manager won't respond to network requests that come in if you're connected on a public network. So, for example, if you go to your favorite coffee shop and then you open up TaxCycle and Client Manager's on your machine, the Client Manager service won't actually be available to anyone else in the coffee shop because it's a public network. However, if you want a greater level of security and you don't want anyone on your domain or on a private network or anywhere being able to talk to your Client Manager server, we can simply check this box, and now the Client Manager server, so I use those terms interchangeably, will not be available to anyone else on my network. It will only be available to me on this machine. But because I want Client Manager to be available to everyone here in the office, I'm going to leave that option deselected. Then I'm going to click Next. So the next part we need to talk about is, where do I keep my tax files? So by default, the name of this computer is called Webinar. It's where we run our webinars from. I have a particular network share here. If I go to my Windows Explorer, as you can see, my data, and here I have my tax files. So this is a network path. This network path is available to everybody in the office here. So that's important. Because my Client Manager, if I go back, is not private, it is publicly available to everybody on my network, I want to make sure that my tax returns are also publicly available to everyone on my network. If my tax returns aren't available to people or my preparers on my network, and Client Manager indexes those tax returns, as we'll see a bit later, when someone runs a search, they go, okay, there's the tax return I want, but because the tax return is not actually on the network and not available to me on my workstation, I can't actually open it. And that can be a little frustrating. So if your Client Manager is public, as I'm doing right now, we highly recommend that you really need to have a public location for your tax returns. And just to prove that, I'm going to add a folder here, CTemp. Select that folder. So now what's happened here is the wizard has detected that I am telling the Client Manager server that I keep tax returns in my CTemp folder. Now CTemp on this machine is only available on this machine. It's not actually available to any other of my preparers in the office. So therefore it's a bit pointless to have Client Manager watch, monitor, and update the status of returns in CTemp, because CTemp is not available to anyone else. I should note, if I actually go back and I do make this a private server, I click Next, CTemp is fine because we know that Client Manager will not be serving search results to anyone else on the network. Let's deselect that because I do want to make this public. Again, the wizard has detected that this folder is not publicly available. You really don't want to have this as part of the monitored folder. So I'm actually going to go ahead and remove this. We can add and remove as many folders as we wish to get this just right. So in the right-hand column here, we have this header called subfolders. And what we're telling Client Manager there is, service, that in my webinar data tax files folder, I actually also want Client Manager to look inside of these subfolders because that's where my actual returns are. So that's quite handy. That means I don't need to go and add a separate folder for 2012, 13, 14, etc. down to 2019. I can just point it at the root of this folder and then tell Client Manager this folder and any subfolders. If there's tax returns in there, I want to know about them. When they get changed, when they get saved, I will take the status of the tax return. I will update my database. So anyone else in the office, when they run a search, will get the most current view of this tax return. So now I'm going to go and click Next. So here we go. Here's a short summary of what we're going to be doing. The server is public. Remember, I left the standalone private server option unselected. The server will be available to others on my network. By default, the Client Manager server will accept requests from some fellow computers on the same domain, or if I use a private network, it will not accept requests from a publicly available network, as I said earlier, like a coffee shop or a shopping mall or anywhere like that. I am going to start the indexing tax returns after I click start here. So what happens there is now I've told the client manager service that we're installing onto this machine the tax returns that I want everyone in my office to prepare, carry forward, file, and so forth are in my shared folder. I actually want you to go and read through those tax returns and update the database. We refer to this as an index. The indexing process is read-only. We do not open the tax returns and save them back to the disk. Client Manager only ever uses the read-only mechanism to read your returns. So it doesn't change your returns where they sit. It opens them up, it takes a peek, and then it closes without making any changes. The last thing I should note here is if you're running a firewall, now traditionally on whether you use a file server or any other network server in your office, it generally will have a firewall on it. By default, the Client Manager service, with your permission, will add itself to your Windows firewall so it can accept incoming requests from others on your network. If you use a third-party firewall such as Symantec or McAfee or anything else, you may have to go and tell that third-party firewall that, hey, TaxCycle and the Client Manager service on this machine are allowed to talk to my network. If you have a professional that helps you set up your office, they would know what to do, or if you set up your own server, I'm sure you're familiar with whether or not you're using the standard Windows firewall, which I suspect the vast majority of you are, or whether or not you've installed a third-party firewall from another vendor. Just a note, it's pretty rare, but if the Client Manager is only available on my Client Manager server and not available to my machines on the network, that could be a cause as to why it's not available. So I'm going to go ahead and click Start. You do need elevated privileges here because Client Manager Server is a service. It runs in the background. It runs 24/7. So as standard Windows security, before you can install a service, you need someone with administrative privileges to do that. So I'm going to click Yes. So now the wizard is installing our server. It's now configuring the server using the name that we gave it. Should only take a moment, and there we go. So our server is now ready, and the Client Manager server is now running on this machine. So I'm going to click Finish, and I'm all done. So one thing by using the wizard that's quite handy is not only did this wizard set up my webinar computer here as my Client Manager server, it has also taken the liberty of automatically connecting this machine to that server, which is great. One less thing I have to do. I should also note that I'm using an options profile. So here's something that's really neat about using options profiles. So I've set up my server and I've told this machine that this is where the server is located. And because that option is kept in an options profile, anybody else on my network who is using my options profile is now automatically connected to this Client Manager server as well. You do not need to go to everyone's desk and do it one by one. If they share the same options profile, as soon as you update the Client Manager server that you're currently connected to here in my options profile on one machine, every machine that uses that options profile is also automatically updated. So it saves a bunch of administration and overhead there, so you don't have to go through each individual machine. So as we can see now, the status of the Client Manager is no longer not installed. We now know that it is running. It is in green. The service is now running on this machine. So as a shortcut, I know that when we finished the wizard process there, we did actually tell TaxCycle and the Client Manager server that we want to run an index once the wizard was finished. So I'm just going to jump quickly to build an index. Now that is done. So as we can see now here on the monitored folders section, the Client Manager server is monitoring the webinar data text files folder. This is the same folder we set up using the wizard. Again, we are monitoring the subfolders. What we can do is we can use this little wizardy button here on the right here, and that will just go through and make sure that the Client Manager has full access to this folder. Again, it only needs read-only access. The Client Manager server does not update or save your tax returns. It just reads them. So as we can see here, this folder is accessible. There's 414 files in here That's all great. The next thing I will point out just quickly here before we ask our first poll question of the day, you'll note here that Client Manager is running, as we can see from the options dialog below it. But what is this NTL Auth authority/system? So because the Client Manager server runs as a service, it runs with a special Windows account called System. This account is built into every Windows operating system, whether you're using a server edition of Windows or whether you're using Windows 10. The reason it is using the System account is the System account does not need you to be logged in. So that means once I set up the Client Manager server on the machine that I want it on, whether that be the file server in your office, the domain server, or just simply the most powerful machine in your office, you can then log out. You don't actually need to have TaxCycle running or someone logged in, because the TaxCycle service will use this built-in System account. Now, I will qualify this, that if you do keep your tax returns on a NAS drive, the network attached storage device, you may need to update Client Manager to run as a specific user account, because by default the System account can't reach into the NAS drive. You likely have to have Client Manager run as yourself. We have fantastic documentation for that online. As we say here, we can simply click on this link and then we've got a step-by-step guide of how to do that. But 99 times out of 100, the Client Manager is running where your tax returns have kept, and it's not a problem. But I just thought I'd speak to what is this NT authority/system account and what exactly is it doing. It's simply running the Client Manager service for us so it can run 24/7 on your machine. So I'm going to go and click OK. So now we can see this is running. In fact, if I do a discovery on my network again, now we'll see we've got the Trilogy HQ server is now running here. You'll notice that earlier, though, the finds, there was 414 files. We've now actually got 573 individual tax returns that have comprised up of those particular 414 physical files. Right, the last thing I will talk about before we ask the first poll question, I need to get ahead here. We'll open this detailed configuration options. I just wanted to talk a little bit more in depth about some of the fine-tuning options we have for your Client Manager service. So as we can see, as I mentioned earlier, the status of the Client Manager is running using the System account. We can temporarily stop it if we wish, restart it, or we can completely remove it from the system. So for example, you've decided to get a dedicated server, or your server has changed, and we don't want this Client Manager service running anymore on my network. We can simply come into options, remove it, and then it is gone. Don't worry, your tax returns stay where they are. You're not actually removing any tax returns or anything like that from network. You're just simply stopping the service from running. So if we wish, perhaps we didn't like the name we gave our Client Manager server when we used the wizard, we can come back in here, we can stop the service, and then we can change the name. We can optionally change the server back to private or standalone, as we saw on the stand-up wizard. By default, the Client Manager service will run an overnight database index. Now what that means is around 1 a.m. in the morning, 1 a.m. in the morning, TaxCycle, the Client Manager server, will simply go and monitor, go to the monitored folders and run a scan and just detect any changes that it may not have seen during the day and make sure that the database and the status of each return is fully up to date. So when you arrive in the office the next morning, the Client Manager data is 100% accurate. There is some more advanced options that generally we leave off. The last one I'd like to do here is just talk about what this client ID value means. So by default, when the Client Manager server looks at a tax return, it takes a combination of someone's social insurance number or the business number if it's a corporation or other entity, the first, last name, and your date of birth. And it uses this, it mashes up those values to uniquely identify your client. Another way you can do this with the Client Manager is on the engagement form of every return, you can assign a unique client ID to that taxpayer. Now, if that unique client ID is present in the return, the Client Manager server goes, well, I'm not going to look at the SIN name and date of birth. I'm going to use that unique ID to uniquely identify this individual or corporation within the database. So by default, for individuals and Tier 1s, this option is off. But for organizations and other types, it's generally on. And the reason we do that is if you use the same client ID for, say, a corporate return, and then you prepare the T4 and the T5 returns, you can simply search on the client ID, and in the Client Manager, you'll get the search results for the T2 return and the T4 returns you've prepared, the T5 returns you've prepared, and so forth. So that's a great way to group an entity together for those types of returns. Now, of course, if you do use a unique ID to identify each individual client, I would stress it's each individual client, not a family. Then you can optionally come back and turn this option on, and that's a way that Client Manager can do that. So there's some of the more advanced options we have in the Client Manager server and what each one means. Of course, you can push F1 at any point, and we've got some great help here on exactly what each option does. You can come through and read about that in more detail. But I'm going to click OK here and click Apply, and then OK. And then I'm just going to push Enter because my option is able, and I'll just run a full search. And here we go. So Client Manager is now running on this machine. It has indexed all of my tax returns in the folder that I told it to watch. And now I can start performing searches to find those various tax returns. So the next section that I wanted to cover as part of the Client Manager Basics today is basic searching. I've sort of gone through the first 30 minutes of this webinar showing how you can use the wizard. We'll come back in later and change some advanced options about, I've identified this is the machine I want Client Manager to run on. This is the folder that I want Client Manager to monitor. This is where I keep my tax returns. I've made sure that the folder those tax returns are in is publicly available to others on my network, whether that be a private network using the Workgroups function of Windows, or whether I have a domain controller and a more sophisticated network. So now we've got that running, and Client Manager has run an index. It's gone through and picked up a lot of information about the tax returns I have in my monitor folder, including my competitor files. Client Manager will index any file we can carry forward from. So if you're switching to TaxCycle this year, don't worry. If you've got returns prepared in a competitor's software, you can tell Client Manager, I also want to know about those returns, and it will show those in my search results as well. So you can have a nice continuity, so you can see your new TaxCycle 2019 file prepared sitting right next to the 2018, 17, 16 returns you prepared using other software. So as I did earlier, I simply pushed Enter in here, and that ran a full list. So as you can see here, my search results for a full list. Tomorrow, I will be speaking a little bit more detail about using quick searches and filters, but today I just wanted to cover basic searching. How can I use the search bar to maximize what I want? So the Client Manager here in TaxCycle is talking to the Client Manager server we just set up. We wanted to create a more web-friendly experience about how you search for things. We don't want you to have to say, I'm searching on a SIN. I don't want to say I'm searching on a business number, or I'm searching on someone's surname. You should just be able to type freely into the search box and find what you want. So for example, I'm going to come in here and I'm going to talk for the Simpson. So that's just simply searching on someone's name. So I should say also that if you wait a split second, you don't actually need to push Enter to have the search results run. They sort of wait a few moments and they'll run for you. So in this case, I've simply searched on someone's name. I can narrow that down a bit. Say I want to see if I've done any 2019 Tier 1 returns for the Simpsons. And as we can see here, I've got the Simpson family. I just resize that a bit to make it more visible here on my screen. And here we've got the 2019 tax return. So we can combine search results. We're not actually restricted into searching on one term. You can use multiple terms to help narrow that down. So for example here, 870. I'm going to find all the tax returns that have a business number or SIN that start with 800. I can narrow that down a bit more if I want. And here we go. So then, okay, that's what I want, 742. So now I can find anyone or any returns, in this case, Robert, where the SIN number is that exact match. So we do use some fuzzy logic there. So if you only ever know the first 6 digits, for example, we automatically find everyone else at the end. Another example is I can simply use someone's postal code. Oh, no match. I think that was meant to be a 3. There we go. So now, as we can see here, as I look through this view, I can simply search on someone's postal code as well. If you know someone's phone number, there we go. We can essentially search on that again. As we can see, we found the Sims family here, Abigail. That's her particular phone number that the client manager server has extracted from Abigail's tax returns. I believe you put the phone number in on the info form and so forth. But again, we've got a whole host of year ends here. If I wanted to combine that with just the 2018 return, because that's the one that I want, we can do that as well. Lastly, I wanted to speak about what else we can search on. You're not just limited to information about a person. Perhaps you want to search on some data in the return. So, for example, I knew I repaired some cupcakes returns here. Cupcake. There we go, Andrew. That's better. So now what we've done here is the client manager, the server, has extracted everyone that actually has cupcakes in the return. In this case, it's gone through and it's found them in the slips. So here, in this case for Howard's, he's got it here in his T2125 and so forth. So you can match that, not only information about the taxpayer, you can actually use the client manager search here to find information about data in the return. So for example, here we can see that Abigail's received a T4 slip from Coffee Time. So if I just knew that in advance, I could type Coffee Time, and here we go. Abigail's return has showed up because that happens to match her T4 slip within her 2018 tax return. Now, there's a whole host of other features. If you simply click here inside the Client Manager search bar and push F1, again, we've got some fantastic help online. Here is exactly what you can search for and the combinations and so forth. So as you can see, you can search on a wide variety of data points. You're not capped to someone's SIN. You don't have to know in advance. You can simply say, oh, I need to find Andrew's return. I know that his postal code is this, or his address is this, or his email is andrew@taxcycle.com, for example. Punch the email address into the search bar and find all my returns, and so forth. So, using a help, I can find my 2016 TROM return that had an HSBC slip in it. So I can simply type that into my search bar, and then we're done. So now that I'm searching for my tax returns here, I just wanted to speak a little bit about how we present the data. So as this particular view here, I'm just going to resize it up a bit so I can get a bit more data on screen. This thing here is what we call the list returns view. This is a tax return centric view. So what we're seeing here is per return. The tax return itself for a given year and an individual taxpayer is what we're presenting. So below here we can see the mailing address for Abigail. We can actually copy that there to the clipboard if you want to paste that somewhere else. Her email address, contact telephone number. We also see all the relationships between Abigail and other tax preparers, including whether that's family members or whether or not Abigail appears as a recipient of a T4 slip or a T5 slip, etc. In the central column here, we can see the different status of the return. It's currently in progress. I need to resolve some review messages here. Who's been assigned this return, the preparer ID, and so forth, the current status, and a little bit more information, whether we use a tracking number, the balance owing, and so forth. And lastly, on the right-hand column here, we actually display a list of all the slips or other forms within the return that we think have pertinent information that gets indexed, so you can go and find, I can see exactly the types of data points and forms that are used within Abigail's 2018 T1 return. Now, if you don't like a tax return centric view, that's fine. We have another view here. This is the client card view. So I'm just going to click that. So this sort of switches your tax return data around. What it says, instead of showing you per tax return, it shows me all the individual clients. So here's Abigail. As we can see, here's her 2018 return, because this is what matches my search box. And then we can see the related documents to that. Again, we can see all the relationships like we could on the tax return card view. And below here, again, we have the various status properties of this individual return. If I'm going to see if I can find, I might clear my filters here simply to get some more data. In the same search box works here. And then we get Abigail. So I've simply removed the more restrictive search term from Coffee Time to simply the Sims family, found Abigail, and as we can see, this is a more focused on Abigail herself, and here are all the returns that we have prepared for Abigail over the years, including the source documents we've prepared along the way using DocCycle. As you see, we can click on each individual return here and have the status of that particular return changed. You can toggle between these views as much as you like, depending on how you like to look at your data. You may settle on one view or the other. Alt F3 is simply the hotkey that you can use to switch back and forth pretty quickly between the two different views. So that's what I wanted to talk to you today about the views and the presentation of your data. Now that Client Manager Server has indexed your data and it's now being served up to TaxCycle, the different ways you can view your data and how you can get the information that you want, whether you want a tax return centric approach or whether you prefer a client centric approach. Let's keep going. So now that I've got Client Manager Server set up on this machine, I've got it monitoring the folder or folders where my tax returns have been kept. I can now run searches from any tax cycle that is connected to that Client Manager Server. And we've sort of talked about the different ways I can look at my data. Do I want to look at it by return, or would I rather look at it by client? So as I've been searching through here, I've noticed, I thought I had more tax returns of this. Why can't I find, Mr. John's tax return? Now this may be because these tax returns are kept in another folder. When I went into the Client Manager Wizard, I selected one folder. It was here, my Webinar Data Tax Files folder. I now have subsequently learned that I have additional tax files conveniently located in this additional tax files folder, that I also have more tax returns that I also want to have indexed by Client Manager, because I want these returns to show in my search results as well. That's fine. We can come back to the Client Manager Server, which is this machine here. I can go back into my options. I can then go to either Open Detailed Configuration Options, which takes me to here, and then I click on Monitored Folders, or I can cheat and simply click on Build an Index, which takes me straight there. Now, as we can see from earlier on in today's webinar, we specified that there was one monitored folder and we included those subfolders. Now I want to add an additional folder. That's okay. I'm just going to click my add. I could paste that folder in here, or I could simply browse to it from here. Select that folder. I also want to include the subfolders. Again, this will instruct the Client Manager Server to not only look inside of additional tax files folder, but also inside these subfolders as well. And as I've added that folder, the Client Manager Server has just done a quick check for me just to make sure that this folder is fully accessible and the Client Manager Server will not have any problems reading the tax returns from this folder. So I can go ahead and click Index now. Just because I've added this new folder here as a monitored folder, the Client Manager Server won't automatically go and index every file in that folder. You have to go tell it that I want to index those files in that folder. Now, don't worry if you forget. From earlier on in today's webinar, as part of the advanced options, the allow the server to reindex the database overnight is on by default. So if you add a monitored folder and you forget to click index now, that's okay. The next day when you come in, the Client Manager server would have indexed all of the tax returns located in every one of these folders. So if you do the setup wizard earlier on in the week and you forgot to add a particular tax return folder, though you know you want tax returns in there, you can come back into the Client Manager server, open TaxCycle, come into options, and you can add and remove those folders as much as you like. It's not a one-time process. You can fine-tune those folders as you go. Now, whilst this index is running, it's almost done. I would give a moment of caution here when you do tell Client Manager which folder to index. If you point the Client Manager folder at the root of your data drive, say for example you have a file server, you have a D drive, this is quite common, and then it's like D data, and then you put all your client data in there, whether it's the working papers or QuickBooks files or tax returns, whatever. If you can narrow down the monitored folders to where your tax returns are actually kept, that does keep the indexing process nice and snappy. As say, for example, instead of pointing the monitored folder to the root of your data drive, which has hundreds of thousands, if not millions of files in it. Just a small note or caution there. So now that is done, the index is done. So any returns that were kept in the additional tax files folder are now part of my index. I'm going to go and click OK. OK again. I'll clear all just simply to run a full list. And as we can see, I've now gone from my 700 odd files I had earlier to 1123. So any of those returns that are located in that new folder are now part of my Client Manager server. Those returns are being monitored, and any changes in the status of those returns, for example, the tax returns being e-filed, will now be reflected in my Client Manager. So that is what I wanted to talk about for subsequently coming back and adding or removing additional monitored folders to Client Manager in case you decide to restore your tax returns differently or create new folders. You can retroactively come back and do that, and Client Manager will take care of it for you. Right, the last part of today's basics webinar is I just wanted to talk a little bit more about some of the rich context menus we have in Client Manager. So now that I see my returns here, that's all very well and good, but I actually want to do some things with these returns. So I'm going to go and pick on Abigail again. Scroll through my results here. I can use the scroll bar here. There we go. And so forth, clicking through my returns. So now that I have my search results, I'd actually like to act on this return. Now, the simplest thing to do, of course, is I can simply click on the file name. That will actually go and open the return for me straight from Client Manager. So I don't need to go File Open. I can click on a search result and it would open. Now that really ties back to the earlier part of today's webinar, that if I had selected a tax return folder that was only available on my server, I close this return, Control W is the shortcut. If I had selected a folder, say CTemp, for example, even though I can see this return here in my search results, I wouldn't actually be able to open it because on my machine here on my workstation, CTemp on the server is not available to me. So that's why when you set up the server, we recommend that you use a network-based path that's accessible to everyone on your network. So I can also right-click on any row here. We can show the file in the containing folder. That's particularly handy if you want to actually go see where it is in File Explorer. We can act on a few other things as well. We can obviously open the return. We can open the return in a new window, which is quite handy. So what TaxCycle has done there is actually open this up in another window and left my search results where you are. So if you have a multi-display setup, that's particularly useful. You can have your search results from Client Manager on one screen, but actually open the returns on another screen. If you wish, you can simply hold down the Shift key, as the tooltip suggests. If I was to hold down the Shift key and click on the file, that would also open the tax return in another window. We can do a carry forward and link, carry forward and plan. So the standard actions you get if you were to do those, however you prefer to do your carry forwards, you do that straight here from Client Manager. Tomorrow, and more of the advanced topics, we'll be covering a batch carry forward, how you can actually carry forward all your 2018 returns all at once. which is quite handy rather than having to do them one at a time. We can copy the file path. That's useful if perhaps you want to file this off to someone in an email and say, here's where the return's located, can you please go look at it? We can remove this return to another folder, and so forth. And the last part here is the change column layout. Again, in part 2 of the Client Manager webinar, we'll be covering column layouts in more detail and how we can use those to really fine-tune the view to see just what I want. The last thing I would point out here in opening returns, again, those rich context menus from right-click on any cell are also available here just above the status window for the individual tax return as well. Now, the last thing I would like to point out here is we do actually list off the used slips and forms in this return. What's really handy here, if I hold down Shift and click on Coffee Time, TaxCycle will open in another window because I held down Shift when I clicked on it, and will also take me to the Coffee Time slip. So I don't actually have to open the return and go find the slip I want. If I can see the slip right here in my search results, again, just click on the slip, TaxCycle will open up and then navigate straight to that exact slip there. So you don't have to go look for it once the return has been opened. So that is all I wanted to cover today in Client Manager, the basics. Today we covered quite a lot of content, from helping to identify which machine would be suitable to install Client Manager server on, how to configure Client Manager so that it monitors the folders where your tax returns are kept, adding new folders to that monitor folder list so Client Manager can maintain status of even more returns. We've gone through a basic walkthrough here of the different views, whether you prefer to look at it by tax return or by client, and then some of the extra features and functions that we have available to us here directly from the search results. So that is all I have time for today. Again, thank you for your participation. Hopefully you've learned something about how to set up Client Manager in your office, or perhaps how you can make a slight improvement to get more performance out of your Client Manager. I always like to call that out at the end here, of course. You can simply push F1. We've got a host of documentation here online about the different things of Client Manager. If you want to delve into something in more detail, we've got everything covered here with our online help. But of course, you can always email us as well at info@taxcycle.com if you have further questions. So with that, I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and I look forward to seeing you in the part 2 of this Client Manager webinar series.